Beginning in the 17th century, a few Europeans, most notably Baruch Spinoza, who was eventually excommunicated by the Jewish synagogue in Holland, in the Netherlands, they begin to take tentative steps towards understanding the Torah as they might any other text. Right? So they don't want to project any of their assumptions about the text or assumptions in terms of what this text must mean onto the text, but they want to read the text to see what it says for itself and not assume anything about the text. By the mid-19th century, biblical criticism was established in Germany and slowly and painfully made its way to England and the United States. The assumption of biblical criticism is that the Torah was written by men. It's got to be men, although one author suggests that there may have been a woman involved in one particular strand of the Hebrew Bible. But generally, the scholarly assumption is that a group of men wrote the texts that make up the Hebrew Bible over a period of hundreds of years. And these men didn't always agree. And if you know anything about synagogue politics or about church politics, the idea that men don't always agree shouldn't come as a great shock. And you see these differences of opinion reflected in the text themselves. So the idea that the Torah, the traditional assumption that the Torah was divine, no. Maybe there was a divine element to it, but it was human authorship. The traditional assumption that the Torah was perfect and there weren't any contradictions, no. Biblical criticism thrives on the contradictions between different authors or different schools that the scholars tell us made up the edited text or the redacted text of the Tanakh, of the Hebrew Bible. And the idea that the traditional idea that the Bible was cryptic also goes by the wayside in terms of modern assumptions about the text. The text means what it says, no more, no less. Okay, so much for our assumptions of modern biblical critics. Now let's take a look at two episodes in the Torah and see how different the Old Testament, Tanakh, Hebrew Bible can be, especially from contemporary Judaism and also contemporary Christianity. So let's start by looking at the creation stories in Genesis 1 to 3. The first thing to note is that I said the creation stories in Genesis 1 to 3. There are two different stories of how God created the heavens and the earth and everything that is in it. The seam between these two stories is Genesis chapter 2, verse 4. And many Bibles actually will show you by splitting the verse in half that the first half of Genesis 2:4 is the coda or the conclusion to the first creation story. And the second half of the verse of Genesis 2:4 is the prologue to the second creation story. Now, these stories are totally different. They have different names of God. In the first creation story, Elohim, which is usually translated as God, is the actor. In the second creation story, Adonai Elohim is the actor. Adonai is the tetragrammaton, that four-letter name of God that was usually pronounced only once a year by the high priest in the Holy of Holies on the Day of Atonement on Yom Kippur. It is usually spoken as Adonai. We don't pronounce that name. And then the translation is usually Lord. So the Lord God is the actor in the second creation story. The first creation story happens in 7 days. There we go. 7 days. The second creation story happens in 1 day. The first creation story in Genesis 1 has human beings created very last. The second creation story has Adam, the human being, created first. The first creation story actually has everything created as an entire species, including human beings. So that when God creates Adam, the Hebrew word is Adam, God creates humanity, male and female, he created humanity, right, in the divine image. It's only when Genesis 1 gets put before Genesis 2 that we get this idea that God created one human being, and how that one human being can be both male and female perplexed some of the early commentators who suggested that the first human being might have been a hermaphrodite. Because in the second creation story, we have only one human being created, Adam, a man, and then later on a woman is created from his rib, or in some understandings from his side. So the meaning of these stories changes radically depending on how the editor places them together. Another thing that's interesting about the creation stories is that, they're relatively insignificant in the Hebrew Bible, especially the Garden of Eden story. The Garden of Eden story gets a couple of mentions in the prophets, not even mentions, but allusions to. The first creation story becomes, prominent in the Decalogue because we're supposed to keep the Sabbath or keep Shabbat and rest on the seventh day according to the Decalogue as it is iterated in Exodus. It's reiterated in Deuteronomy. Why are we supposed to keep the Sabbath on the seventh day? Because God created the heavens and the earth in 6 days, and on the seventh day God rested. Of course, Shabbat becomes much, much, much more important to Rabbinic Judaism than it does to the Bible. So, the creation stories are there at the beginning, It's a good way to begin a story. Especially if you understand, or if the editors understand, that this God that we're talking about is the universal God of all humanity, so you start off with creation. But the importance of the creation stories is much more important to Pauline Christianity and Rabbinic Judaism than it was to the redactor or the authors of those stories in the Torah themselves. So although Judaism and Christianity read the creation narratives differently, their readings are deeply influential for both faith communities. For example, you've got 6 mentions. This is the refrain. There was evening, there was morning, day 1. There was evening, there was morning, day 2. Rabbinic Judaism understands that because it says there was evening, there was morning, day 1, that the day begins in the evening. Now, this causes much confusion when you're looking at a calendar that has the Jewish holidays, because it'll tell you when the first day of the holiday is, but you start celebrating that holiday on the previous evening because that's how the rabbis understood the Hebrew Bible. Well, that's probably not what the Hebrew Bible meant. And indeed, there was a Jewish scholar in the 13th century in France whose rabbinic name is Rashbam, Rabbi Shmuel ben Meir. The rabbis are very interested in acronyms. So everybody, if you've made it in the Jewish world, you know you've made it because you have your own acronym. So Rashbam is Rabbi Shmuel ben Meir. Turns out to be Rashi's grandson, and we'll talk much more about Rashi in the future. He said, no, the text in Genesis 1 tells you what God did during the day. God punches the time clock at 5 a.m., then it's then it's evening. God doesn't work in the evening. He keeps regular hours. And at the dawn, when there's morning, that's the conclusion of day 1. And now we're going to start to tell you what happened in day 2. So a day is a kind of commonsensical day when the sun rises. He says that's what biblical scholars agree with. But nevertheless, in Judaism, in Rabbinic Judaism, you light candles on Friday night to start the Sabbath, not on Saturday morning. Did Rashbam want to light candles on Saturday morning? No. Absolutely not. But he said, look, let's be honest about what the Hebrew Bible means, and then let's do what the rabbis tell us to do. In Christianity, Pauline Christianity from St. Paul understands that the human disobedience in the Garden of Eden by eating from the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, which God had specifically commanded Adam, not so explicitly Eve, but specifically commanded Adam not to eat from, that stained all future generations of human beings. Well, you don't get that idea from the Hebrew Bible itself. Indeed, in Genesis 4, you've got the story of Cain and Abel, where God specifically says to Cain, you've got this tendency to do evil, this psychological tendency, but you can master it. Human beings are not depraved and committed to a life of sinning and transgressing. You can overcome that through your own free will. But Pauline Christianity emphasized this idea of original sin as a way to explain what Jesus came to atone for. So Judaism doesn't understand that there is original sin, neither do contemporary scholars from the Hebrew Bible itself, that original sin is something that was an interpretation of the Hebrew Bible by early Christian communities, just like the day starting in the evening was an interpretation of the Hebrew Bible or of the Torah by early rabbinic communities. Okay? So what scholars say about this text is often very much at odds with what the faith communities of Judaism and Christianity have to say about this text. Okay, the next element in the Hebrew Bible we're going to take a look at is the prohibition of seething a kid in its mother's milk. One of my colleagues at Vanderbilt, Professor Jack Sasson, recently wrote an article saying, yeah, we got it wrong. One of the interesting things about Hebrew in the Torah is that it doesn't have any vowels, it doesn't have any punctuation, it doesn't have any capital letters. So you really have to have an interpretive stance toward the Torah to know where one word begins and one word ends, and if it should be read as a declarative or an interrogative. In this case, Lo tevashel gidi b'chalav imo, which is the prohibition against seething a kid in its mother's milk, Professor Sasson suggests was misread, that it really should say not chalav in its mother's milk, but chelev, right? Same letters, but different punctuation, different vowels. So you shouldn't see the kid in its mother's fat. Oh, you shouldn't see the kid in its mother's fat. What does that mean? That you shouldn't kill 2 generations in one day, because the only way you can see the kid in its mother's fat is if you kill the mother to get the fat. And indeed, there's another verse in the Hebrew Bible that says you shouldn't kill 2 generations of a species of animal in one day. So it makes perfect sense. And then Professor Sasson goes on to cite other ancient Near Eastern parallels to this idea. But that's not how the rabbis read it. The rabbis read that prohibition as you shouldn't see the kid in its mother's milk. Now, I would argue, or at least suggest, argue might be a little too strong, that the reason why the rabbis read the verse that way is because of their assumption that the Bible was perfect. Being perfect, the Bible doesn't repeat itself. God assumes that people are going to be listening closely and reading closely. And so you don't need to have 2 verses that say, don't kill 2 generations of species on the same day. So you've got one verse that says, don't kill 2 generations of species on the same day. You've got another verse that you read as milk instead of fat, right? And it gives you a different law. The problem with this law is that it's repeated 3 times. But what about the assumption of perfection, that God doesn't repeat himself? So the rabbis here assume that each time the verse is repeated, it's coming to teach us something new. That's the language of yeshiva, right, or Jewish seminary. Right? And sometimes they use their thumbs in order to illustrate. So the first time the Bible tells us do not see the kid in its mother's milk, it means do not cook milk and meat together, right? It's a specific example of that general prohibition of cooking milk and meat together. The second time, wait, I'm on this thumb. The second time the Bible says do not see the kid in its mother's milk, it means that you shouldn't eat milk and meat together, even if it's cold, right? That's something new. Does it say that in the Hebrew Bible? Is that the plain contextual meaning of the Hebrew Bible? Is that what modern scholars say the Hebrew Bible means? No. But with this rabbinic assumption of the perfection and the fact that the Torah is cryptic, right, meaning that you have to read deeply into it, that's how the rabbis understood the repetition. Now I'm back on this thumb. And the third instance of do not see the kid in its mother's milk means that you're forbidden from financially benefiting from the combination of milk and meat. Right? In other words, well, this is a question now. Can a Jew that's committed to traditional Jewish law work at McDonald's, where you're selling Big Macs and not Whoppers with cheese, but right, cheeseburgers? So when I was in yeshiva in Jerusalem, seminary, my teacher asked us that question, and we said, we just learned this law. No, because if you can't benefit, you're getting paid from serving milk and meat together. But it was a trick question, because the meat that McDonald's serves is not kosher meat, and these laws only apply to kosher meat. So you can't serve kosher meat and milk together, and you can't benefit from them being served together. Okay, fair enough. So we see here that these 3 rabbinic rereadings, or 2 rabbinic rereadings, of the second and third repetitions of that verse vary greatly from what the Hebrew Bible, or scholars of the Hebrew Bible, will tell you those verses mean in context. That's an example of how Judaism often interprets the Hebrew Bible in ways that are very much in tension or at odds or in disjunction with the plain sense of the Hebrew Bible.